It is my pleasure to chair the first session today, in which we are going to look at the implementation of the information and public participation provisions of the directive we mentioned earlier, so the Radioactive Waste Directive. We'll focus on reporting, as those are the major means for transparency and sharing information. I'm also looking forward to seeing the views from the different stakeholders on this subject, and I think it will be an interesting session. So we have 5 presentations to look forward to, and to start with, my colleague Gianfranco Brunetti will present the implementation of the Radioactive Waste Directive in the European Union. So this is based on the second report of the European Commission, which was based on the reporting cycle due from the member states as of August 2018. We published our report in December of 2019. So Gianfranco will particularly refer to the outcome of this report, and hereby I would like to pass the floor to him.
So what I'm going to do is to present to you the status of implementation of the Radioactive Waste Directive based on the conclusions of the second reporting cycle that ended at the end of 2019, and in preparation of the upcoming one that is not far away from us. So I think that it's also timely discussion today in view of this preparation. So the directive will become in August 10 years old. And so it's indeed a good time now to check how far it has shaped the management of radioactive waste and spent fuel in the Union, and whether it met the expectation of the stakeholders and the European citizens. As Mr. Garribas underlined in his opening, the directive is part of a unique regional system of binding instruments, all centered on safety, nuclear safety, under the Euratom treaty umbrella. Here in this slide, you see the timeline that shows how we got there and what were the drivers that made the member states align on those legal acts, with a particular note on the Fukushima accident, as it was mentioned also earlier. The directive, the Waste Directive in particular, focus, of course, on the safety and responsibility in the back end of nuclear life cycle, where 2 underpinning pillars exist. I'm maybe repeating already what was stressed out, but one is the avoidance of any undue burden to future generation, and the second is the necessary public information and participation. So there are enshrined in the directive overarching principles for a safe and responsible management of radioactive waste that appear well aligned with the key issues discussed in all fora and context. First there is a principle of minimization, waste minimization, that call for full application, in fact, of the waste hierarchy. So first avoid, eventually dispose of only after a series of preferred options are pursued. And these are all in line with the most relevant policies that aim at sustainable process. So, and here we have seen in the recent year quite a lot of learning, especially from some progressing decommissioning activities in the Union. Second principle that is also very, very important in my opinion is the coverage of all steps, so from cradle to grave. It's very important that the process is led from its end, so the safe end that we want to reach. And as long as there is not clarity on this end, the process will not progress in a fluid way, in a proper way. So we should not disregard any aspect of the full picture. Third principle is about long-term passive safety. Another key aspect of waste management. We have to deal with it for a long term, and therefore safety feature cannot be only limited to active aspects. Fourth principle, the so-called polluter pays principle. The cost has to be borne by those who generate the radioactive waste. This is enshrined in the directive, although it is referred specifically to waste generator, not generally to polluters, as a polluter pays principle. And last, and this is an element of transparency, is the process based on evidence and documented decision making. So it's an important part that of the national frameworks, that any decision has to be taken according to a very well established procedure and process. So those are the principles. These are enshrined in the directive. And nonetheless, it is for the member state. So while the directive sets the principle and makes them legally binding at the EU level, the member states have to convert them into policies, actions that establish national gearboxes, like it is represented in this visual here, national framework. So there are implementation elements that are up to the member states, and it is part also of our job at the Commission when we assess the implementation of the directive to see how this is done. So about the second report of last year, well, second to last year, I mean, two years ago already, even, of the Commission. That report was based on 28 national reports, as it is required by Article 14 of the directive. And of course, in the future, we will have a bit less. First of all, the report provides to the EU citizen via this reporting format from the Commission to the other institution, but it provides to all EU citizens an overall picture of the quantities of radioactive waste and spent fuel. So it's providing a quantitative measure of the size of the waste management issues in the Union. Member states have substantially different waste classification schemes and approaches because they originated from their history and they respond to their needs. They are very depending on national arrangements. Nonetheless, we were able to at the Commission to pack up, I mean, to aggregate the amounts to give a EU picture of a general picture by making full use of the IEA standards for radioactive waste classification. So using this scheme, it is possible to quantify that about 3.5 million cubic meter of waste are of the very low and low level category, so therefore they are to be routed for surface disposal. A route that is already operated in a number of member states with now some decennial operational experience. And in fact, from the data that the Commission was able to report, it is shown that 79% of this amount was declared already as disposed of at the end of 2016. We will see at the next reporting cycle whether there will be some progress in this respect. For the remaining part, I would just like to quote the directive. It is broadly accepted at the technical level that at this time the deep geological disposal represent the safest and most sustainable option as the end point for the management of high-level waste and spent fuel considered as waste. This is for the time being, at least, this is where we see the steering of the programs and the national actions. An important new element of the second report with respect to the previous one that showed some already a first improvement in the report, in the quality of the reporting from the member states from the past, is the fact that for the first time this report shows also projections for the next decades, at least until 2030. This is also an important requirement of the directive, that we need to see, as I said earlier, at the full picture from cradle to grave. And so we need to project into the future needs for waste management and prepare for them in advance. So knowing this projection is very important to check whether the national programs are well aligned and can deliver what they are supposed to deliver. Of course, there is still some improvements there to be achieved. For example, just referring to the date, we might be able to see further in the future, to check further in the future the next cycle. So going back to the management of high-level waste and spent fuel, what it is noted in the report is that 3 member states have progressed in the planning for deep geological repositories, and also that they are forerunners in these projects, also on a global scale. So therefore, they are being watched by all angles. I mean, they are interesting projects per se, because they are the first of a kind in a way, and they are very important to also to demonstrate the feasibility for future activities. However, the most important, more important observation from the report is that if on the one hand we have 3 forerunners, on the other hand the progress in other member states is still very limited, and plans are generally very long term. So the question raised very spontaneously: is this in line with the principle of avoiding a new burden to the future generation? So the national programs have, as they stand now, they defend the national approaches, of course, with this decision postponed until the next century sometime. However, the validity of this approach will have possibly to undergo the proof of the Court of Justice to test to what extent the directive, as it reads now, sets obligation for short-term actions and solutions. That said, and regardless this observation, we need research, of course. We need research and development. And so the link to the future session for this event is then very natural. But as you can see from the second graph on the left bottom of the slide, there are not many research sites specifically dedicated to the issue of disposal of high-level waste. So I think that this is something to be further developed and explored in the future. Transparency, so the key topic for today. As it is reported it was reported in 2019, the Commission had not found any major flaws in the implementation of or transposition and implementation of the directive in respect to the transparency requirements, in particular the Article 10 of the directive. There are a number of approaches, but the report does not show any major flaws. However, we have to stress that transparency is also linked to many other provisions of the directive. And for example, an area where we didn't see any brilliant response from the implementation in the member states is the area of key performance indicators in national program. We believe that key performance indicators are a tool for transparency. Most of the times they are simplistically overlapped with timeframes and milestones, which are important pieces of information. Do not misunderstand me, please. But they are not proper key performance indicators. They are not providing the information that the key performance indicators will provide to a program manager, such as, for example, trying to measure the success rate of national policies in meeting waste minimization targets, or the success rate in optimizing the management system, or the effectiveness in transparency measure. So indeed, the lack of stronger key performance indicators is a missed opportunity for higher transparency on the one hand. And also, it is also a missed opportunity for who is in charge of the programs of the plan to steer them with a stiffer control mechanism and reach, a more effective and efficient delivery of the objectives of the programs. Another area where that we see it's anyway closely linked to transparency, and it was a point of attention in the report, is the assessment of costs of the national program that is still high to still subject to some high level of uncertainties. The Commission reported in 2019 that the overall costs for radioactive waste management in the Union ranges from 422 to 566 billion euro. Those figures include still the United Kingdom, of course. That is one of the major share together with France and Germany, which altogether those three states represented more than 3/4 of the cost estimates. But yeah, this is an area where improvements are needed because uncertainties in cost assessment trickle into the risk for financing schemes. So, and this can impair or can affect the principle of that requires that waste generator bear the cost. So we have DG ENER and in the Commission we have carried out some topical studies on those matters. I will provide you later at the end of the presentation a list of all the studies that we have carried out so far and the ones that are coming in. But this aspect, the aspect of the financial aspects of the backend, have been subject to a lot of attention from our side. Self-assessment and international peer reviews. Mr. Gariba already stressed the importance of this provision under the directive. It is again another big opportunity for achieving higher transparency on the developments in the several member states. We at the Commission supported the work of the IAEA to develop a dedicated peer review service for the international peer reviews, because I mean, this had to be created on purpose also to give some tools to the member states to comply. And so far, as you can see from the timeline, there have been a number of peer reviews that were carried out, 8, if I see well. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020 created a gap in the planning. So although there were a number of peer reviews scheduled in 2020, they had to be postponed. But you see that most of member states, but to have scheduled already the peer review by the deadline of 2023. It will be a challenging plan for all of them, but we are following this with a high level of attention and providing support to be sure that the tools to carry out this process properly are there. In our view, the Artemis has merits so far that I mean we tell it as a success story. All reports coming out from this peer review are public, so they are immediately published on the IAEA website after the mission. So to summarize the conclusions of the Commission report of 2019, the Commission noted and recognized that member states had made a number of steps towards demonstrating that they have been taking reasonable actions to ensure that no undue burden is passed to future generation and that the radioactive waste and spent fuels is managed safely. However, as I could already point out during the presentation, there were a number of areas where the Commission called for acceleration and further progress. So decision on policies, concept and plan for disposal of high-level waste. This is a very important issue, one of the most challenging as well. The adequacy of funds, so therefore all what is linked to the cost assessments and financing scheme. The level of implementation of a national program, and so here key performance indicators come back. And the level of quality of inventory and projections and the capacity to plan the resources that are needed to handle safely and responsibly radioactive waste also in the next year. So I would conclude with the next slide that is a listing for you, for your future reference, the number of studies that we have published on our website. Some of them have been published earlier. The last 3 in the list were published just before the end of year. And they are covering specific topics that we found to be worth of further investigation. They feed into possible developments for future actions. And also we have a number of studies upcoming, ongoing and in preparation. One of them, I wouldn't say surprisingly, is about key performance indicators. So it's a study that research how these have been set out in the national plans, and we really are looking forward to the results because as we said, we see quite ample margin for improvement there. And another study that is in preparation, the procurement procedure for obtaining the support of an expert contractor is ongoing, is a study on radioactive waste classification schemes in the European Union. As I mentioned earlier, member states have their own classification schemes. It is fully compliant with the requirements of the directive. But what we would like to see with this study is all opportunities for possibilities to have a common reading of the amounts and the type of waste in the Union. I would complete here. I would be glad to receive questions in the discussion and let the floor to next speaker. Thank you.
Our next presentation will be given by two speakers. So this is Mrs. Gabriele Mraz, who works as a scientist at the Austrian Institute of Ecology. And she's also a member of Nuclear Transparency Watch and since 2020, a member of the Austrian Commission for Radioactive Waste Management. And the second speaker is Patricia Lorenz, who is also currently nominated as an expert for the Austrian Governmental National Nuclear Waste Management Commission. So they are going to present the report on the implementation of the Waste Directive, so from a third-party view, which is updated on the basis of the second report of the Commission, which we have just heard. So ladies, the floor is yours.
We decided that only I give the talk and Patricia Lorenz, she will also be available for questions afterwards. Patricia Lorenz and I, we are members of the joint project, Nuclear Risk and Public Control. In the joint project, European NGOs, mostly from Central and Eastern European states and research institutions, cooperate since 2003. And since 2015, we monitor the implementation of the Nuclear Waste Directive and national waste management programs. We made a report which we update regularly and publish on our website. And the most recent report will be available end of January, beginning of February. Our work in the joint project is supported by the Austrian Ministry for Climate Action and this most recent report also by the Viennese Ombuds Office for Environmental Protection. Yeah, in our report, we cover a lot of topics where we identified problems during implementation of these first years, and I want to go into more detail for some of them. The other ones you can read about in our report. Yeah, the first, this is something Mr. Brunetti also has mentioned, time delays and in general, poor implementation of quality of the national programs, meaning that focusing on the key performance indicators, we also found that most national programs did not provide key performance indicators which are necessary for quality control. And yeah, since the first national programs were submitted, the timetables have changed, but no, for example, no sanctions have been defined in these national programs in case of delays. I want to especially mention the multinational repositories, which are listed in some national programs as one of the possible options for backend management. But most countries define them in a way that results in neglecting and delaying the search for any national solution. Well, what are the consequences if the final repositories are not available in the next years or decades? Then interim storage will turn into long-term interim storage. But the facilities for interim storage and also the containers were not constructed for such long-term periods, 100 years or even longer, especially the old ones. They do not fulfill currently needed safety standards, for example, withstand a crash of a commercial airliner. Yes, it will take quite a long time to finally have a final repository. And therefore, civil society fears that if one final repository is operating at last, there is a risk that it will be enlarged or even filled over capacity to avoid a difficult search for a second one, third one. Yeah, costs and financing. Mr. Brunetti also mentioned this, and we found that the costs of the nuclear waste management programs are unclear. And it is really important to know who is making the cost estimates. They're mostly made by the operators. And yeah, many estimates are intransparent, and this leads to an underestimation of costs. The polluter pays principle is the theory, but already huge financial gaps have been identified in some countries. I want to quote something from the Artemis mission for Bulgaria from 2018. A recommendation was the government should ensure that financial provisions for geological disposals are made. And this recommendation was made because the peer review team was informed that the costs for the geological disposal were not included in the activities that are covered by the fund at all. Also, the topic of unforeseen costs has to be discussed. I want to mention the famous example of the ACE repository in Germany. The recovery of the ACE waste might cost the taxpayers a huge amount of additional money. And yes, what are the consequences? The taxpayers will have to pay for the lack of finance. And in our opinion, this is another argument why civil society needs to participate more in waste management. Transparency and participation. One of the well-discussed problems is that the national programs have not been subjected to a strategic environmental assessment in many member states. Of course, it is foreseen that environmental impact assessments will take place for the facilities to be built, but it's not enough to conduct environmental impact assessments to ensure effective participation. Participation in the national waste management programs is not foreseen in later steps, for example, during future safety reviews, but would be necessary. For many NGOs, the focus on the passive safety for the post-closure phase is no guarantee for long-term security. An important topic concerning participation is also the right to veto, especially for siting communities. Will it be enabled or not? This should be clear from the beginning of a waste management policy and concept. What are consequences? If no SEA is undertaken, then environmental impacts of the National Waste Management Program have not been assessed properly. And when interim storage is becoming long-term interim storage, it's not clear if there will be an environmental impact assessment ongoing at all. But without trust and communication at eye level, no national program will reach the necessary acceptance by civil society. And it's also really necessary to make resources available for supporting the participation of civil society. And it's also necessary that some concepts that are important for civil society will be included in the debates, like rolling stewardship models and concepts. Yeah, inventory and the minimization of future waste. Well, we identified the problems that are not all types of wastes, radioactive waste are covered by the directive, especially military waste, some norm wastes, but also legacies like the drums that have been disposed of in the sea when this was still legal. It's not clear how long the nuclear programs will be maintained and therefore how much additional waste will be created. The inventory is not well enough documented, especially the content of older canisters is often not known at all. They need to be repacked. What are consequences? Parts of civil society insist on a fixed date for nuclear phase-out before engaging in the discussions about a final repository at all. And if only part of a country's nuclear waste is in the scope of the national program, credibility is lost. I come to our conclusions. We said from the beginning that the Nuclear Waste Directive is a good thing and is certainly welcome, and we still think so. The member states implement it insufficiently. This needs more support, and more sanctions are also needed in our opinion, especially concerning the implementation of Article 10, which is in our opinion by far not enough, resulting in a high risk that the national programs will not work. Therefore, we suggest a guidance for member states how to implement transparency and participation, and that the member states should also provide a budget or other resources for participation of civil society. I want to end my talk with a remark referring to another current debate. Until there is no nuclear waste management established, that not only authorities but also civil society assesses as safe enough, nuclear should be kept out of the taxonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let's move to our next speaker, who is Mr. Robert Harbers, who is the policy officer at the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, the division on the fundamental aspects of nuclear waste management, selection of disposal site, and he is going to present his views as member of the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. So, Mr. Harbers, the floor is yours.
I'm happy to speak here and share with you the German viewpoint on the implementation of the Euratom Waste Directive and public participation. As mentioned, my name is Robert Harbers and I work for the Federal Ministry of the Environment in Germany since 2017. A central element of the 2011-70 Euratom Directive is the national program. In our case, the program consists of 5 reports. The roof report describing the general policy of waste management in Germany is underlaid by 4 reports, which are all regularly updated. First, there's the Joint Convention report. Then there's the report on the implementation of the 2011-70 Euratom Directive. There's an inventory of radioactive waste. And last but not least, a report on the cost and financing of waste management in Germany. As mentioned, the lead document, the national program itself, contains the abstract strategy for the management of spent nuclear fuel and radioactive waste in Germany. After the submission of the program, the Site Selection Act was amended in 2017 on basis of the findings of the Commission on the storage of high-level radioactive materials, which was held from 2014 to 2016. This did, however, not call for any changes of the national program. A transboundary strategic environmental assessment was carried out, including a broad public participation, which I will come to later in detail. All actors responsible for the management of radioactive waste in Germany have to take the national program, which was agreed upon by the federal government, into consideration regardless of whether it concerns high, intermediate, or low-level radioactive waste. All information are publicly available, including the different waste management routes, site-specific inventories, and cost estimations. As mentioned before, a strategic environmental assessment was conducted based on drafts and an environmental report of the national program. All underlying documents and statements were published. The nationwide and transboundary consultation led to numerous responses. As a result, an addition was made to the program stating that bordering countries will be offered consultation in accordance with internal binding provisions. In general, many requirements of the directive were already met by the German waste management system. The established national legislative, as well as the regulatory and organizational framework, are already in existence, so the system described in the national program was mostly already in place. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but the historically grown and established system with treatment, storage, and disposal facilities already existed. As for the missing pieces, such as the disposal site for high-level radioactive waste, there's a clear route to find and establish such a disposal facility. All these policies are defined via laws, ordinances, guidelines, and programs. As mentioned before, the Site Selection Act was amended in 2017, and last year some underlying ordinances were finalized, which I will speak of in detail in a minute. A national strategy of radioactive waste management in Germany is based on broad public consent. A national strategy of radioactive waste management in Germany is based on broad political consensus, which is part due to the work of commissions, such as the one on storage of high-level radioactive materials, or the one concerning the financing of the nuclear phase-out. As indicated, Germany is currently on the search for a disposal site for high-level radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. The geoscientific-based site selection investigates 3 potential host rocks: salt, clay, and crystalline rock, applying exclusion criteria and minimum requirements. The remaining potential sites are narrowed down by weighting criteria. All these criteria are predefined in the Site Selection Act and therefore publicly available. They are all applied in all 3 phases of the process alongside preliminary safety analysis, which I will give you an overview of in the next slides. Here you see an illustration of the site selection process for the disposal facility for high-level radioactive waste in Germany. In the first of the 3 phases, which Germany is working on at the moment, all existing data about the geology is gathered and evaluated. On this basis, siting regions for an above-ground exploration are selected by federal law. To further the data on which the criteria and preliminary safety analysis are applied in order to select at least 2 sites for below-ground exploration, again by federal law. In the third and final phase, a last application of the criteria and safety analysis will lead to the site proposal, which will again be decided upon by federal law after broad public participation process. As you can see, the preliminary safety analysis play an important key role in the site selection process, which is why the corresponding ordinances concerning the requirements for preliminary safety analysis and the safety requirements for a disposal of high-level radioactive waste were subject to a nationwide public participation process. Alongside a 2-day symposium, which was filmed, documented, and published, there was a website for comments and informational videos, as well as the opportunity to hand in written statements. The 2 ordinances are based on one another. The first one determines the licensing conditions for the disposal facility, such as the passive and safe containment for 1 million years in a maintenance-free, robust, multi-barrier, deep geological disposal system. Then the preliminary safety analysis with the preliminary safety analysis, it is assessed whether a certain potential siting region can be expected to meet these requirements based on the gathered data and the geological information. With growing knowledge about the geological situation, the safety analysis will be able to go into more detail and produce more reliable statements. Accordingly, in the first phase, there will be representative preliminary safety analysis in all identified areas by the implementer, as shown in this little map. I'm certain that the Federal Company for Radioactive Waste Disposal will go into more detail about this map in their presentation later today, so I don't want to anticipate that. In the second phase, based on the data from the above-ground exploration, further developed preliminary safety analysis will be carried out on the remaining potential siting regions. Finally, in the third and final phase, there will be comprehensive preliminary safety analysis before a decision for a disposal site will be made. During the entire process, there will be a broad public participation. I will only cover this part briefly, for this could be a topic by itself. There are several participation bodies intended from a regional level, such as the regional conferences, all the way to the national level, like the National Civil Society Board, of which members are also present here today. The most recent one being the Sub-Areas Conference, which will start its work this February. A complex program, such as the one based on the 2011-70 Euratom Directive, needs to be evaluated and optimized. In order to do this, in 2019, Germany organized the Artemis mission, as mentioned before, with a very successful outcome. The reviewers attended Germany a mature legal and regulatory framework for the safety of radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel, and gave one good practice for the National Civil Society Board. Of course, there were some suggestions and 3 recommendations, which were thoroughly analyzed. A respective action plan is created in order to implement appropriate changes until the follow-up mission next year. Since Germany underwent the IRS mission in the same year as the Artemis mission, there was the hope for some positive synergy effects. The IRS mission covers all aspects of nuclear safety, whereas the Artemis mission focuses on the waste management. Unfortunately, these expectations for synergy effects could not be met. However, we think it can still be useful to have these 2 separate missions. I want to finish my talk with a short outlook onto the upcoming developments regarding the national program. Up until now, there were no fundamental policy changes since the implementation of the national program, so the plan is to evaluate it latest by 2025. By then, all nuclear power plants will be switched off in Germany, and the site selection process will be further advanced, which gives us the chance to identify weaknesses and misconceptions. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation, and the only thing left is to thank you for your kind attention. If there are any problems, I will happily try to answer them. Thank you.
We have 2 more speakers in this session. So we just had the view from Germany, and we will now move to Denmark. We have Mr. Christopher Brix-Bertelsen, who is the senior advisor with the Danish Agency for Higher Education and Science, where since 2016 he has been the agency's project lead on a stakeholder involvement process of Denmark's radioactive waste management policy. And Mr. Brix-Bertelsen will now give his views as member of this Danish ministry. So the floor is yours.
Before I set out, I'll just thank Niels Henrik Hugge of NOAA Friends of the Earth Denmark and Honorine Ray of Nuclear Transparency Watch for inviting me to speak on this event. I really look forward to share my experiences or our experiences with you and to learn a lot more from the presentations over the next days. So just to introduce myself very briefly, I have been working with these transparency and stakeholder involvement work for the past 5 years. And not so much over the past year, because I have also been active on the COVID-19 task force of our ministry. So some disturbance there, I will say, but nevertheless, I'll mainly focus on what we did or have done in terms of securing information and participation from the public regarding our national program in radio waste management. So next slide, please. And this is my agenda, just for you to know what I will take you through. I think my presentation will be some 10 to 12 minutes, so there will be some time, I hope, for some brief clarifying questions. But in any case, otherwise we'll take those in the debate or discussion session later on. So my first point is the Danish case, building an ecosystem of dialogues. So basically, you need to know that in Denmark, there was quite a bit of political confusion regarding the national policy on radioactive waste management. We don't have have never had nuclear power plants in Denmark. So basically, our radioactive waste stems from 3 research reactors and a hot cell facility, which were operative since the late 50s until 2000, when the last facility was closed down. So it's not that we are talking very large volumes or very large amounts of radiation, but in any case, this nevertheless gave birth to quite a lot of political discussion because the efforts to decommission the research facilities came to a conclusion in 2011, and following from that conclusion was a very big report which was debated in public, and which was laying the basis for a further investigation of siting in 6 localities in Denmark. Unfortunately, they had not been very much warned on beforehand. So obviously that led to some consternation locally. In 2015, the transfer of the brief of finding a disposal solution happened. And it meant the transfer from the Ministry of Health to my ministry, Ministry of Higher Education and Science. And with this transfer, not only we had a reorientation of the policy process, but we also introduced a new focus, and rather belatedly, I must admit, on stakeholder involvement. And basically, the point of departure was that we need to include adherence to the 2 pillars of the Waste Directives, Article 10, information and participation. So what did we do? Well, first of all, we made sure that we sourced a contact point to service the stakeholder ecosystem. And I've provided the links for you in my presentation. So you can just click as soon as you get the presentation to get more detail. So I will not go into much detail at this point. But secondly, we established access to information and sources. And this was quite important because at that point in time, which is the beginning of 2016, there were, in fact, numerous sources pertaining to the various explorations of ways to manage the Danish radioactive waste, and not least finding a way to describe the disposal facility. So there is quite a large body of reports, research, assessments, etc. And we try to maintain or establish and maintain a full access to all these sources. More importantly, and thirdly, we formed a national contact forum, which is, I guess, kind of like the German National Civil Society Board, where we had the idea to facilitate dialogue between the central stakeholders of the discussions. And this was very much on the basis of our experiences with the not so happy process from 2011 until 2015. So we tried to make sure that we included all the stakeholders who had been active in those discussions, and of course also made sure that government institutions and agencies were represented as well. So the idea was to have a sort of a one-stop shop where all stakeholders could meet and engage in dialogue over various aspects of the national program. Later on, we adapted this concept to the local level so that we would continue this form of dialogue with stakeholders more locally interested in various issues, and I will get back to that in a later slide. Fourthly, we created an independent expert panel to answer questions from the public, and this very much arose from a need, an expression of a need from public stakeholders to have independent access to knowledge and assessments, scientific evaluations, points of view on various aspects of radioactive waste management. So we actually asked the Danish Agency for Research. They have under their umbrella an independent research council, who was then asked to point out the members, or to find the members of this independent expert panel. So the ministry did not play any part in that appointment procedure. So what have we learned? Well, obviously, trust is hard gained and easily lost when it comes to radioactive waste management, and not least communication and stakeholder engagement. We have learned that we should take much more attention, or have to put much more attention to make sure that public views are in fact and effectively incorporated into our process. It is quite, I would say, it's beyond doubt that the ability to secure a national policy through a parliamentary resolution in 2018 would simply not have happened if we had not upped our game, so to speak, in terms of being more earnest and more efficient when it came to the stakeholder engagement process. So I think we have, at this point in time, earned a bit more trust than was the case when we had the initial planning of the contact forum and other stakeholder engagement activities back in the beginning of 2016. Secondly, we have learned that the rules guiding dialogue, they must be clear and agreed upon. So one issue, for instance, and it may seem a very petty issue, but nevertheless, it's very much a part of my daily work. It is to ensure that whenever minutes from meetings between stakeholders are agreed upon and okayed for further publication, it is very important that participants only engage in what they said themselves in the meetings, and not what somebody else said, because that is sort of the basic rule that we should we should respect each other to such an extent in these fora that we can actually also respect that something that we personally find may be wrong or in any way in other cases not pertaining to the issue, but is nevertheless reflected as a point of view. So that brings me to the third point here. Understanding is as important as knowing, and that has very much to do with the fact that since we do not always have the same knowledge altogether, we who are participating in these kinds of dialogues, it is really crucial that we have an understanding of what is actually meant from our dialogue partners' point of view. So we have spent quite a lot of time trying to establish a platform where this understanding would actually be achieved, and where, as a consequence, also the mutual respect, which must be present in a dialogue for it to be efficient, can be maintained. And this again brings me to the fourth point here, which is that we live in an era of alternative facts, and we live in an era where we have more or less anything goes conditions when it comes to public discussions of anything, and that is, I would say, a fact of life. And if we want to deal with that, we should probably take heed of the simple possibility of emotions and worries to become a primary data source for the dialogue that we wish to have with our stakeholder communities. So we try to take that very seriously, and we try to accommodate as many viewpoints as possible, knowing that of course we need to reach a decision at some point when it comes to, say, for instance, decisions regarding how to site a disposal facility and so on. But as long as we can try and get a common ground as to what are facts in this context, I think we have a possibility of just striking this. Well, if not a consensus, then at least a consensus as where we are disagreeing, which is also important. So we are on the brink of entering into a communications situation where we will need to discuss the siting of a disposal facility in Denmark. We are currently awaiting a report from the geological studies of Denmark and Greenland, and they will come up with a report outlining very broadly where it would be feasible to look further for a potential location of a disposal facility. So basically, we are we are just about to start the preparation of communication strategies to facilitate this dialogue, and of course we will do this together with our stakeholders. So we basically wish to conduct a dialogue not just on the actual disposal facility process, but also how do we communicate? What is the efficient communication when it comes to the siting process? And this is something that we will take up with our stakeholders in the National Contract Forum and of course elsewhere too. So later on, when we have established the communication strategy, we will, as part of that, prepare process for the facilitation of partnerships, because we intend to facilitate a voluntary process regarding the identification of possibly interested local communities and authorities to engage with us in a joint exploration of the feasibility of a disposal facility in a certain area. So we will very much work along a line of facilitating the dialogue, which should be based on voluntarism in the local communities. And finally, we will align this partnership process with the process of preparing a disposal facility. And this is actually where you can say the technical processes regarding waste characterization and the development of a disposal facility concept will be aligned with the partnership process, so that this too is something that interested local communities and authorities, in fact local stakeholders in broad terms, will be invited to speak. Yeah, questions. I understand that we should have questions after all the presentations, so I think I'll just skip that, and my next slide is just thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So I would then move on to the next presentation, which is the last one of this session, and then we will look at the questions. So our last speaker is Dr. Johan Swan, who is since 2005 the director of the Swedish NGO Office for Nuclear Waste Review, called MKG. And he's also the member of the management board of Nuclear Transparency Watch and the coordinator of the NTW work on radioactive waste management. Mr. Swan will give us details on the BEPR report, a study which was financially supported by the Commission. So, Mr. Swan, the floor is yours.
So I will make a presentation of a report that we've in Nuclear Transparency Watch called the BEPR report. The idea behind the report was to provide some discussion about what could be effective implementation of the Aarhus Convention in the context of Article 10 on transparency in the Nuclear Waste Directive. My name is Johan Swan, and I work, as you heard, for MKG in Sweden. I will also be presenting something about in the Swedish Roundtable tomorrow, where we will discuss more Swedish issues. So for this presentation, I will cover only NTW issues and the BEPR report. So a short background. Basically, NTW was founded in the autumn of 2013 and started the work in 2012 and started the work in 2013. And you all know that the directive, the Waste Directive, was adopted in July 2011. And the first national reports were delivered with the programs in August 2015. Early in the existence of NTW, we had discussions with European Commission, DG Energy, concerning how it would be possible to perhaps evaluate the implementation of Article 10 on transparency in the member states. This led to a situation where, with funding from the Commission, NTW worked on a project to study how efficient transparency, that's public information and participation in radioactive waste management, could be described. And the result was the BEPR report. It was published in December 2015. There is also actually a version with the Commission as a result of the work. And the BEPR report is like the NTW version of that report that the Commission has. And it was actually foreseen at this time that the Commission would support a roundtable on the issue of transparency in RWM. And actually here we are today, even though it's some years later. So here is the picture of the report. So I was one of the authors, together with Phil Kearney from NTW and Civic, which is an Irish NGO. Nadia Schlesnik was then at REC, who is now at EIMV in Slovenia. Vanessa Liston from Civic, Gilles Herray-Dubreuil from Metadis, Jan Haverkamp, who was NTW and Greenpeace, and Patricia Lawrence was NTW in this case. And if you wonder what BEPR stands for, it actually stands for Broad Framework for Effective Public Participation in Environmental Decision-Making in Radioactive Waste Management. And the report can be downloaded from the Nuclear Transparency Watch website. And actually, I suggest that you do that at one time or another and peruse it. It's quite an interesting report. It has many components. So I will now describe much of the contents of the report. So it starts by discussing transparency as defined in the directive, which in that directive, in Article 10, there are broadly formulated requirements for public participation, public information in decision-making in radioactive waste management. But it's the very broad formulations. A second part is discussing the Aarhus Convention and transparency, the convention as a basis. And there we've already heard today about the 3 pillars of access to public information, access to information, and access to justice. Then there is a chapter which discusses the BEPR pillars for effective transparency. I'll come back to that. And also the NTW BEPR key components of effective transparency in radioactive waste management. And I'll come back to that one also. Towards the end of the report, there's also a suggested system for evaluating effective transparency. I'm not sure how valuable that is as a tool, but at least if you're interested, you can look at it. If you are interested in possibility of evaluating transparency, for example, in different member states. Towards the end, there is sort of like a moving forward with transparency, concluding remarks and messages. And there are 2 appendices, one which actually is quite large that goes through relevant research and experience from other processes on transparency, and also a discussion about international and European governance on transparency in radioactive waste management. So basically the BEPR pillars for effective transparency are based on the pillars of the Aarhus Convention. So effective access to information and communication, effective access to public participation and consultation, effective access to justice, and access to the decision-making processes. But also a 4th one, which is the effective access to resources. That is the different parties taking part in participation needs resourcing in some way to be able to have a totally effective transparency. So then shortly the BEPR key components of effective transparency in radioactive waste management. And remember now, the report develops these issues more in detail. I don't have time to go through it in more detail here. So the principles of building societal confidence or trust, that's important. Discussing issues in a multi-generational perspective. There are long timescales involved with radioactive waste management, both the question of how dangerous, for a long time the waste is dangerous, but also for the decision-making. Decision-making may continue over decades in many cases for decision-making, and of course the implementation also takes decades. So this has to be taken into account in effective transparency. Also questions regarding safety and risk, how they are perceived by the public, taking that seriously into account and taking it seriously the way that the public may have a different perspective on certain issues of safety and risk than perhaps, for example, the waste management organizations. Also, to perhaps engage the transparency issues in energy policy, so that in order to include waste perspectives in energy policy discussions in a member state, and to connect the waste issues with the energy issues. Then there are points of practices, how to enhance the dialogue, how to create spaces for trust and dialogue, how to demystify and democratize radioactive waste management, how to open up, let's say, how the issues are discussed in a country. There is a tendency, of course, for the discussions to take place in quite closed circles in many cases. How do you demystify and democratize and open up such fora? You can have more new decision-making processes. For example, decision-making processes that start very early and may also be more deliberative. And also the question of horizontal as well as vertical information exchange. Vertical information exchange, that is basically like a top-down discussion, but horizontally, when you open up and have more actors involved, it can also enhance transparency. And of course, the importance of implementing access to justice so that it's possible to actually influence decision-making processes by, for example, the civil society and local communities. Finally, then, the innovation in resources and transparency assessment. It's quite important to make sure that civil society, both the local communities and the NGOs, have the resources to participate, and also to create the conditions for civil society to have access to its own expertise, and also to be sure to engage experienced and widely trusted facilitators. Also, it's important perhaps to collect good practices somewhere, so it's possible to learn about how to have good effective transparency, and perhaps also standards for transparency assessment. So I will just say a few words about the broader goals of the BEPA project. The BEPA project has not been working very hard for the last years, and we are very happy now to have the Commission make this roundtable where we hopefully can discuss these issues also in NTW further on. But the broader goals have been to establish enduring governance models to providing resources to NGOs on the national and local level. And then also to improve the technical and legal capacities of NGO representatives participating in research projects. We'll discuss that more this afternoon. And to promote the inclusion of civil society and NGOs as part of the RWM arena, to include also NGOs and civil society in different fora. And also enable the development of legal framework for effective public participation that takes due account of the input of NGOs. And finally, to involve civil society and NGOs as respected partners in international and European networks. And that is what I want to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Swan. And in fact, thank you to all of the speakers in this session. Then I see here questions to basically all of the speakers. So let me start with the question to Mr. Harbers. Concerning interim storage of spent fuel, the Schleswig court decided that the storage facilities at Brunsbüttel were not sufficiently secure, a conclusion that is important for all NPPs. Is there a national program to improve security of these temporary storages? So Mr. Harbers, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on interim storage, so this is a quite detailed example, and the national program is on a more abstract level. So I cannot answer this question, unfortunately. So I would forward this question to my colleagues who are responsible for this area of expertise, and I will hand in the written answer after the session. I'm really sorry, that's not my area of expertise, and I don't want to say anything that's not true. So unfortunately, I can't answer that right here.
Okay, so we will get back to that after the this event. So is that okay for Jan?
Yes.
I hope so. Okay.
As I understand, there will be a gathering of all questions anyway, so I think I can hand in an answer by then.
Okay, then we have a question to Gianfranco Brunetti, so to the Commission basically. What is your response to the view that your principles for spent fuel management are unrealistic, considering spent fuel is dangerous to life forms forever? For example, there is already an undue burden on future generations, and the continued generation of nuclear waste increases the burden.
I understand from the question that the principles are put under discussion here. And well, indeed, spent fuel and high-level radioactive waste remain dangerous for long time periods, beyond, I mean, virtually forever if we compare to lifetime. However, I would stress the importance of the fact that 28 member states have unanimously agreed on those principles and enshrined them in the EU law via the directive. And the principle is, I mean, it can be seen as unrealistic, but it obliges to act, not just to wait and see. And this is the important aspect of the application of those principles. Otherwise, the burden will remain and will not be tackled. So there is a moral obligation to pursue this. So in terms of principle, as a citizen, I am very much satisfied that these are legally binding in the Union. And this is one also of the aspects why Mr. Garriba expressed some pride in the fact that in the under the Euratom Treaty we have currently a set of legally binding directives that translate principles and standards that are normally at the level of international conventions and standards into law. This is the specificity of it. So this is what I think about this point.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to depart a bit from the order because there was one question concerning the joint convention. Indeed, given that all member countries of the European Union have signed and ratified the joint convention on radioactive waste management, what happens if there are contrary provisions? So in case the text, which text has priority, joint convention or the directive? So in principle, they don't contradict because the waste directive was modeled very much along the lines of the joint convention. The big difference is that the radioactive waste directive has binding requirements on the member states. So there might be different formats of reporting required, and we have been working together with the IEA and the NEA and everyone who basically requires member states to report to make sure that those requirements are as harmonized as possible, but the provisions cannot contradict. So now getting back to the order of the questions. This one is to Mr. Briggs-Bertelsen. Do you agree that engaging the public on a plan for nuclear waste disposal is made much easier if there is a finite amount of radioactive waste, such as in Denmark? Which is being dealt with compared to countries who plan ongoing programs of radioactive waste creation from continuing or expanding nuclear generating programs such as France or UK or Poland, Czech Republic and Slovakia. So Mr. Briggs-Bertelsen, please.
Well, thank you for the question, David. I think it's a very interesting one, actually. I think I partly agree with you. But there is also the challenge that if you have not, if you have a finite amount in of radioactive waste, and I mean, we don't even have that in Denmark. We don't have waste from NPPs, but we certainly do have other kinds of radioactive waste coming out from our health sector, industry, etc. So, so I think we are pretty much in the same situation, but on a lower level so than the countries that you're mentioning here. I think actually it could also work the other way around. So in a country where you never had nuclear power, like in Denmark, and you haven't had any active research program in the nuclear field for the last 20 years, what happens is that people forget, and also the competence base is in danger of being eroded. So that could actually make it more difficult for a country like Denmark to actually engage the public, because you would have to start building the knowledge in a very much different way than you would do in a society where you had NPPs and you had have had an ongoing discussion for years about this. But I think still there might be some interesting parallels if you look at where the disposal sites all over Europe are actually being planned. It always happens to be very close to well, nuclear power plants or facilities having dealt with issues relating to nuclear power production. So there might be some truth in the reverse also, that the more you are engaging or being engaged, I would rather say, with these issues, perhaps it's more easy for you to understand why it needs to be dealt with. Whereas I think in Denmark, for a number of years, the public opinion very much was that, but we don't have nuclear power plants. We don't have, in fact, very much nuclear waste at all. So why can't we just let it sit where it is and just look after it from time to time and not bother anymore about it? Well, of course, this is a caricature, but that is also pretty much the view that some participants in the debate took. So I think, well, the boring answer to your question is, well, it's both and. I do agree to some extent, but not entirely. Sorry.
Thank you. There's one question here from Céline Parot to all the intervenants, but also asking for the views of the national experience on how to divide radioactive waste and from energy production and basically the sources. So if that's okay for the questioner, I'm going to leave that for the next session after we've heard some of the national experience. We have here a question concerning the key performance indicator study. So I'm going to answer actually the first part. The second part I'll leave for Gianfranco, to whom the question is raised. So why was the non-implementation of these indicators invoked in the infringement mechanism if it only initiates a study in 2020? So the situation is actually reversed. We realized that so many member states had difficulties with the key performance indicators, as you've also heard referred to in the number of infringements in this area, that we are now found that the best way to address this is to see where the problems are and to see for those member states that have found a good way to define KPIs that they can share the experience. And for the second part of the question, I would leave this for Gianfranco. So the question is, I believe that all the key performance indicators that you want to propose to the member countries must go through the nuclear safety filter. For example, reducing the volume of radioactive waste can be a dangerous indicator from the point of view of nuclear safety, and not only. If you'd like to respond in any way, Gianfranco.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it's an important point. And indeed, whenever we do studies like this one, we involve experts. In this particular case, we are working in strict cooperation with our decommission advisory group, ENG, whereby there is a working group that is dealing specifically with the waste management issues. So we engaged with ENSREG earlier than the preparation of this study, and we got also support in the preparations for the specification of the study, and there will be an involvement also in the making of the study. So clearly, we are having a view of the safety regulators all over the EU on the results.